Russia, a land of immense history and culture, has also been the stage for some of humanity's most chilling acts of violence. Over the past century, amidst revolutions, wars, and societal upheavals, a sinister thread has woven through the country's timeline. A series of predators whose actions defied comprehension and whose legacies left scars on entire communities. This is not just a tale of murder, but a journey through the evolution of evil. From the chaos of post-revolutionary Moscow to the forests of Siberia, these 5 stories reveal how cruelty adapts, how trust can be betrayed, and how justice struggles to catch up. Each chapter unveils a new era of fear, told in chronological order, capturing the historical and societal contexts that allowed these crimes to fester. Who were these individuals, and what drove them to commit atrocities that shook a nation to its core? Let us uncover the top 5 most notorious criminals in Russian history and explore their chilling stories together. In the chaotic aftermath of Russia's revolution, the country was plagued by hunger, poverty, and lawlessness. Amid the bustling markets of Moscow, where survival often depended on quick trades and trust among strangers, a shadow moved unnoticed, a predator hiding in plain sight. Vasili Komaroff, a horse trader by trade but a killer by nature, turned desperation into opportunity, luring unsuspecting victims to their deaths. What makes his story so chilling isn't just the brutality of his murders, but the cold efficiency with which he carried them out. For 2 years, bodies piled up along the Moscow River, yet no one could connect the dots. This is the tale of a man who turned trust into a weapon, and how a nation's broken justice system struggled to hold him responsible for his crimes. The year was 1921. Russia was still reeling from the aftershocks of revolution and civil war. Famine stalked the countryside, and the streets of Moscow were filled with the desperate, the displaced, and the destitute. Amid this turmoil, Vasili Komaroff appeared to be an ordinary man, a simple horse trader eking out a living among the throngs of the city's merchants. But beneath this facade lay a predator who saw human life as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. Komaroff's modus operandi was chillingly simple. Posing as a horse trader, he would advertise the sale of livestock, attracting buyers eager to secure animals for transport or farming. His victims were typically men from rural areas, drawn to Moscow by the promise of a deal. Komaroff would invite them to his home under the guise of finalizing the trade. Once inside, he wasted no time. Using a blunt object, often a hammer, he would strike his victims on the head, killing them almost instantly. Their bodies were stripped of valuables before being stuffed into sacks and disposed of in the Moscow River or buried in shallow graves near his home. Komaroff's efficiency was staggering. Within a matter of minutes, a transaction turned into a murder, and the unsuspecting buyer became another nameless corpse. By late 1922, rumors of missing traders began to circulate. Fishermen along the Moscow River reported finding bodies tangled in reeds or floating downstream, many showing signs of blunt force trauma. Initially, authorities suspected rival traders or criminal gangs, as Moscow's black market was rife with violence. However, as the body count grew, it became clear that this was no ordinary spree of violence. The victims had little in common except their profession and the circumstances of their deaths. Investigators began piecing together a pattern, but leads were scarce, and the chaos of the time hindered progress. Komaroff might have continued his killing spree indefinitely, were it not for a stroke of bad luck. One victim managed to escape after being struck and alerted the authorities. Though he could not identify his attacker, the survivor provided enough information about the location and method for police to narrow their search. In early 1923, suspicion fell on Komaroff after neighbors reported seeing a steady stream of visitors to his property, who never seemed to leave. A raid on his home revealed damning evidence: blood-stained tools, clothing belonging to missing men, and shallow graves containing dismembered bodies. Komaroff's trial was swift and highly publicized, serving as a rare moment of unity in a fractured society. In court, he showed little remorse, admitting to the murders with a chilling detachment. His wife, who had initially claimed ignorance, was also implicated but received a lesser sentence. In July 1923, Komaroff was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. His death marked the end of a reign of terror that had gripped Moscow, but the scars of his crimes lingered long after. Komaroff's case remains significant in Russian criminal history, not just as an account of unspeakable violence, but as an example of how systemic failures in law enforcement allowed a killer to thrive. It highlighted the need for better investigative techniques and coordination among authorities, lessons that would be crucial in handling future cases of serial murder. Komaroff's story is only the beginning. Decades later, in the forests of Rostov, another predator would emerge, a man whose crimes would eclipse even those of the Moscow butcher. Stay tuned for the chilling tale of Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov. The story of Vasili Komaroff, the Moscow butcher, seemed a grim relic of Russia's tumultuous post-revolutionary years. His crimes had scarred a society struggling to rebuild after chaos. But decades later, as the Soviet Union sought to portray itself as a bastion of order and control, another predator emerged, one whose actions would prove far more horrifying. Andrei Chikatilo was not just a killer. He was the embodiment of evil disguised as an ordinary man, hiding in plain sight as he terrorized the Rostov region for over a decade. His crimes were not born of necessity or desperation, but of an uncontrollable hunger for violence. Born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village during Stalin's regime, Chikatilo's early life was a crucible of suffering. Famine and fear defined his childhood, leaving him malnourished, socially awkward, and bullied. These early traumas planted the seeds of his later violence, as did his frustration with his own physical and sexual inadequacies. By the 1970s, Chikatilo had built a life that, on the surface, seemed respectable. He was a teacher, a husband, and a father. But behind the veneer of normalcy lurked a man consumed by dark fantasies. In 1978, those fantasies turned to action. Chikatilo's first victim was a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakotnova. He lured her into the woods near Shakhty, a small mining town, and attacked her with unspeakable savagery. Though the crime left him shaken, it also awakened a compulsion he couldn't suppress. Over the next 12 years, Chikatilo would kill at least 52 people, primarily women and children. He targeted the vulnerable, those walking alone near train stations, bus stops, or forests. Offering help or companionship, he led them to secluded spots where he would unleash his monstrous urges. His attacks were marked by extreme brutality, including mutilation and, in some cases, cannibalism. The crime scenes were so horrific that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the violence. The Soviet Union's tightly controlled image of order and progress played a key role in Chikatilo's ability to evade capture. Authorities were reluctant to admit that a serial killer was operating within their borders, fearing it would reflect poorly on the state. The investigation suffered from missteps and tunnel vision. Police arrested and executed an innocent man, while Chikatilo continued killing. The randomness of his attacks and the lack of forensic technology further hampered efforts to catch him. By the late 1980s, advances in investigative techniques and public pressure forced authorities to act. In 1990, Chikatilo was finally arrested after acting suspiciously near a train station. Evidence from his previous attacks, including eyewitness accounts and forensic links, tied him to multiple murders. During his interrogation, Chikatilo confessed to his crimes in chilling detail, describing his actions with a detachment that shocked even the most hardened investigators. His trial in 1992 became a media spectacle, with families of victims demanding justice and Chikatilo taunting them with his cold demeanor. Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. In 1994, he was executed by a single gunshot, ending a reign of terror that had paralyzed the Rostov region. His death brought a measure of closure, but the scars he left on his victims' families and the broader society remain indelible. Chikatilo's crimes forced Russia to confront the limits of its law enforcement and the deep flaws in its justice system. His case spurred advancements in forensic science and criminal profiling, tools that would prove crucial in catching future killers. But Chikatilo's story also served as a grim reminder. The seeds of evil can sprout in silence, nurtured by neglect and trauma. And as his name faded into infamy, another predator began to emerge. A towering figure who preyed on the weak and vulnerable in Moscow Oblast. The arrest and execution of Andrei Chikatilo left Russia reeling, but the fear had hardly faded when whispers of another monster began to spread. This time, it wasn't the dense forests of Rostov that were stained with blood, but the outskirts of Moscow, where a hulking figure prowled in search of easy prey. Sergei Ryakhovsky, later known as the Giant Killer, brought his own brand of terror to the country. Where Chikatilo's crimes were calculated and fueled by his own psychological torment, Ryakhovsky's were opportunistic, savage, and driven by an unrelenting desire for dominance over the weak. His victims were society's most vulnerable: elderly women, pensioners, and even children. Born in 1963, Ryakhovsky lived a quiet life in Moscow Oblast, where his imposing 6'6" stature earned him the nickname the Giant. Despite his size, he was an unremarkable man who blended easily into his surroundings. But in 1988, Ryakhovsky's true nature began to surface. His first known victim was an elderly woman walking alone near Balashikha, a small district on the outskirts of Moscow. He attacked her with terrifying ferocity, strangling her and leaving her body in a remote area. From then on, Ryakhovsky struck without mercy, targeting those least capable of defending themselves. He saw his victims not as people, but as objects of opportunity. Using his immense physical strength, he subdued them quickly, often employing ropes, knives, or blunt objects to end their lives. Between 1988 and 1993, Ryakhovsky claimed the lives of at least 19 people, though investigators suspect the true number may be higher. His victims were primarily elderly individuals and women, though he occasionally targeted men and even children. The murders were marked by grotesque acts of mutilation, with some victims sexually assaulted post-mortem. One of his most shocking crimes was the murder of a 15-year-old boy whom he lured into a secluded area. The brutality of the attack underscored Ryakhovsky's complete lack of empathy and his growing confidence in evading capture. His ability to strike repeatedly without leaving clear evidence baffled investigators. The randomness of his attacks, coupled with the limited forensic tools of the time, allowed him to move freely, leaving behind a trail of fear and unanswered questions. Ryakhovsky's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely if not for his increasing carelessness. In 1993, a would-be victim managed to escape after a violent encounter with Ryakhovsky. The survivor provided authorities with a detailed description, including his towering height and distinct appearance. The breakthrough came when police apprehended Ryakhovsky near the scene of one of his earlier murders. During his interrogation, investigators discovered damning evidence linking him to multiple killings, including personal items belonging to his victims. Ryakhovsky's trial revealed the full extent of his crimes, shocking even seasoned investigators. Unlike Andrei Chikatilo, who relished the attention his trial brought, Ryakhovsky was subdued, showing little emotion or remorse. He was convicted of 19 murders and sentenced to death, though his punishment was later commuted to life imprisonment after Russia imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. He now resides in a maximum security prison, his massive frame a grim reminder of the terror he once wrought. Ryakovsky's case deepened the scars left by Chikatilo, underscoring how easily predators could exploit society's most vulnerable. For Russia, his crimes were another blow to public trust in law enforcement, which had struggled to identify and apprehend him for years. Yet, even as Ryakovsky's story faded, another killer began to make his move. Unlike the opportunistic giant killer, this new predator saw murder as a game, a chessboard to be conquered, one square at a time. The capture of Sergei Ryakovsky in 1993 brought momentary relief to a nation haunted by serial killers. But just as Russia began to heal, another predator emerged, one whose ambition was as chilling as his crimes. While Ryakovsky preyed on society's weakest, Alexander Pichushkin turned murder into a twisted form of achievement, driven by a macabre obsession to kill enough people to fill every square on a chessboard. Pichushkin wasn't content to hide in the shadows. He wanted his crimes to be remembered. And as the chessboard killer, he would become one of the most infamous names in Russian history. Born in 1974 in Moscow, Alexander Pichushkin's childhood was marred by hardship. A severe head injury at the age of 4 left him with lasting neurological damage and emotional instability. Struggling with social rejection, he found solace in playing chess, a game where every move was calculated, deliberate, and under his control. But chess was not enough to suppress the darkness brewing within him. By his teens, Pichushkin had developed a fascination with death, reportedly idolizing the infamous Andrei Chikatilo. As he grew older, this morbid curiosity transformed into a sinister ambition. Pichushkin's killing spree began in the early 2000s, centered around Bitsa Park, a vast green expanse in Moscow. The park, with its winding paths and secluded areas, became his personal hunting ground. His victims were often homeless men, elderly individuals, or vulnerable people he encountered on the streets. Pichushkin approached them under the guise of friendship, offering vodka and companionship. Once they were deep inside the park and intoxicated, he would strike, usually with a hammer. The brutality of his attacks was staggering. Pichushkin would bludgeon his victims with such force that their skulls were shattered. In some cases, he shoved broken vodka bottles into their wounds, ensuring they couldn't survive. For Pichushkin, the murders were more than just acts of violence. They were a game. Each victim represented a move on his personal chessboard. He meticulously kept track of his kills, marking off a square for every life he took. His ultimate goal was to fill all 64 squares, a horrifying testament to his calculated ambition. By the time he was caught, Pichushkin had killed at least 48 people. In his own words, "For me, life without murder is like life without food." By 2005, Moscow authorities had noticed an alarming pattern. Bodies were being discovered in and around Bitsa Park, all bearing the marks of blunt force trauma. Despite the growing number of victims, the randomness of the attacks, and lack of forensic evidence made it difficult to connect the murders to a single suspect. The breakthrough came in 2006, when Pichushkin made a critical mistake. His final victim, Marina Moskalyova, was a colleague who had told her son she was meeting Pichushkin that day. When she failed to return home, her son alerted police, providing them with a name. Security footage from a metro station showed Pichushkin walking with Marina just hours before her death. This evidence, combined with DNA and other forensic links, led to his arrest. Once in custody, Pichushkin was unrepentant. He confessed to the murders with chilling pride, even admitting to additional crimes the police had not yet uncovered. During his trial in 2007, he openly stated that his goal had been to kill 64 people to complete his chessboard. The courtroom was stunned by his arrogance and lack of remorse. Pichushkin described his murders in detail, explaining how he lured his victims and the satisfaction he derived from their deaths. His trial became a media sensation, with the nation transfixed by the horrifying spectacle of a man who viewed murder as a game. Ultimately, Pichushkin was convicted of 48 murders and 3 attempted murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. Alexander Pichushkin's crimes left an indelible mark on Moscow, transforming Bitsa Park into a symbol of fear. His chessboard remains one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in modern criminal history, a physical representation of his cold, calculated evil. Yet even as Pichushkin's trial ended, whispers of another predator began to emerge. This killer, unlike Pichushkin, operated under the guise of trust and authority. He wore the badge of a protector, but his crimes revealed the heart of a predator. Russia had weathered a century of terror from its most infamous killers, from the opportunistic Vasili Komaroff to the calculated Alexander Pichushkin. But none wielded the trust of their victims quite like Mikhail Popkov, a man who turned his position as a police officer into a mask of safety and protection. Behind that mask lay a predator, whose crimes would eclipse even the darkest chapters of Russian history. Known as the Werewolf of Angarsk, Popkov hunted for nearly 2 decades, claiming the lives of at least 78 women. His betrayal of authority and the brutality of his murders left scars that Russia still grapples with today. Mikhail Popkov was born in 1964 in the industrial city of Angarsk, Siberia. Outwardly, he led an enviable life. A respected police officer, a husband, and a father. Yet, beneath the surface, Popkov was consumed by a hatred for women he deemed immoral. His double life began in 1992. Patrolling the streets of Angarsk in his police car, Popkov would target women walking alone at night, often offering them a ride under the pretense of helping them. He used his badge to disarm suspicion. Once he had gained their trust, Popkov drove his victims to remote areas, where his true nature emerged. The attacks were ferocious, often involving rape and mutilation, leaving the bodies unrecognizable. Siberia's icy climate preserved many of the corpses, revealing the horrifying extent of his brutality to investigators. Popkov's victims were typically women aged 16 to 40, often those walking home after socializing. He viewed them as symbols of societal decay, justifying his actions as a form of punishment. The brutality of his methods shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Victims were bludgeoned, stabbed, or strangled with such ferocity that forensic examiners often struggled to determine the exact cause of death. Popkov sometimes used his police-issued tools to carry out his crimes, turning the instruments of law enforcement into weapons of destruction. For years, his identity as a police officer shielded him from suspicion. When bodies were discovered, Popkov even assisted in the investigations, skillfully diverting attention away from himself. By the early 2000s, the string of murders in Angarsk and its surrounding areas had drawn national attention. Investigators began to notice patterns, particularly the victims' demographic and the remote locations where their bodies were found. Despite the growing pressure to find the killer, Popkov remained elusive. His insider knowledge of police procedures allowed him to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. For nearly 2 decades, he hunted with impunity, confident that his uniform rendered him invisible to suspicion. In 2012, advancements in DNA technology finally provided the breakthrough investigators needed. A mass DNA sweep was conducted in Angarsk, targeting men who fit the profile of the killer. Popkov, believing himself untouchable, willingly submitted a sample. The results were undeniable. Popkov's DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. The werewolf of Angarsk had finally been unmasked. In custody, Popkov confessed to 22 murders initially. But as the investigation continued, the true scope of his crimes emerged. By the time his trial began, he had admitted to killing 78 women. making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. Popkov showed no remorse, instead rationalizing his actions as a twisted form of justice. His calm, matter-of-fact descriptions of the murders horrified the court, painting a picture of a man entirely devoid of empathy. In 2015, Popkov was sentenced to life imprisonment, with additional sentences added as more of his murders were confirmed. He now resides in a Siberian penal colony, his life confined to the cold, isolated wilderness that had once been his hunting ground. Mikhail Popkov's crimes shook Russia to its core, not just because of their scale, but because of the profound betrayal they represented. His position as a police officer allowed him to exploit his victims' trust, exposing the vulnerability of those who rely on authority for safety. For the families of his victims, the knowledge that the killer had been among them all along added an unbearable weight to their grief. For the nation, Popkov's case underscored the urgent need for reforms in police accountability and investigative transparency. Popkov's story brings this harrowing tale full circle, back to the lesson first taught by Vasili Komaroff nearly a century earlier. Trust is the predator's most powerful weapon. Across decades, from the chaotic streets of post-revolutionary Moscow to the frigid woods of Angarsk, Russia's most infamous killers have shown the enduring fragility of human life in the face of evil. But even as their stories shock and horrify, they also illuminate the resilience of a society determined to confront and overcome its darkest shadows. Though the werewolf, the chessboard killer, the giant, the butcher, and the Moscow butcher have left their mark, their legacies are warnings, not triumphs. Evil, no matter how it manifests, can be fought. And through vigilance, justice, and remembrance, the cycle of terror can be broken. The stories of Vasili Komaroff, Andrei Chikatilo, Sergei Ryakovsky, Alexander Pichushkin, and Mikhail Popkov represent more than just the darkest chapters of Russian criminal history. They are stark reminders of humanity's capacity for cruelty when unchecked by conscience or accountability. Each killer exploited trust, vulnerability, or societal failures to carry out their reigns of terror, leaving scars not just on their victims, but on an entire nation. As a criminologist, these cases underline critical truths. First, evil often hides in plain sight, whether behind the guise of a helpful traitor, a trusted teacher, or a law enforcement badge. Second, society must remain vigilant against the conditions that enable such atrocities: unchecked trauma, systemic corruption, and the silencing of vulnerable voices. Finally, the power of modern forensics, psychological profiling, and public awareness cannot be overstated. They are indispensable tools in both preventing and solving such crimes. Above all, these stories remind us of the importance of remembrance, not to glorify the killers, but to honor the victims and to learn from the past. Through understanding and action, we can ensure that the horrors wrought by these men serve as warnings, not legacies. For as long as we remain vigilant, evil may emerge, but it will not prevail.